Hi YouTube! I'm back with another kind of nonfiction booktube video. I've gotten really good response to the last one I put up, where I talked about several books, and this time I think I'm actually going to record several videos about the same book. So I'm not exactly going to review it formally, but sort of like I did last time, talk a little bit about things that are coming up for me tangentially to the book. And I had 3 different ideas for videos that came up out of reading this book, so I thought I would just share those one by one. So the book is called Queering Gay and Lesbian Studies, and it's by Thomas Piontek. It was it came out in 2001, so it is a little bit dated. If you're interested in reading the book, I did put a full review up on Goodreads, which you can find Avery Fawcett on Goodreads. I'll try to remember to put it in the description as well. But I found that surprisingly, even though it is a little bit dated, that it was really interesting. And it's academic, but it's not super inaccessible language, and it's pretty slim. It's like 97 pages, so you can get through it. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about comes out of the second chapter of the book, which is about what Piontek calls the gay male sex wars. It's basically that period of time, post-AIDS. I think this particular was happening around the early 90s, at least as far as I remember, where you had kind of camps coming up of like, how do we address HIV and AIDS in the gay male community, and camps of like what he calls sex positive and sex negative. I think those words have come to mean different things in the mid 2000, like before 2010, whatever you call the noughties, the mid noughties, and then like the mid teens, between that period of time, those terms kind of mean something different. But he's talking about sort of like, really it's a version of the old kind of, do we assimilate? Are we different? Like, what do we go with? Do we, claim our sexuality? How do we claim our sexuality? But I'm not going to talk a lot about that, like, actual argument, but more something that I thought was interesting that came up in that chapter was talking about how the idea that gay men are, like, all about sex kind of comes from the fact that gay men, at least did not, and at that time, have access to marriage. And so not having access to the one mainstream sort of formally sanctioned way to exercise one's sexuality, and not even having it as a future possibility, like if straight folks are sexual, but then they're like, if you think of it as a precursor to marriage, it sort of sanitizes or normalizes it, so that it doesn't become like the highlight. Whereas with gay men, because that was never an option, there's this kind of myth of promiscuity and association of being gay with being sexual. And you could also talk about why wouldn't that be true for lesbians, and that's a whole nother story. But in any event, it made me think a lot about polyamory, and how now I think there's a certain degree of this, particularly with people who are monogamous, and particularly with people who don't have a lot of exposure to polyamorous people. I've noticed that the first thing folks jump to is sex. Like, the first things folks think about when they hear polyamory for the first time is often sex. And part of that is because a lot of people's only model for non-monogamy is cheating, and so sometimes, although not always, cheating is, the catalyst for cheating is sexual. I don't think that's always true, but I think the like story we have is often of a man cheating on his wife because he wants more sex. That again is a very like scripted version. There are certainly people who cheat for, because they're not getting emotional needs met, but that is the like Hollywood idea of what cheating is. And so when people hear non-monogamy, they think cheating, and therefore when they hear polyamory, they think sex. When like I've come out to people at work or talked about being polyamorous, there's this kind of like feeling of like, oh, Avery, you're such a player, I bet you got all the ladies or whatever. I'm like, that's so weird. Like, I'm like a spectrum, and not like somebody who, I don't know, my actual sexual activity is far less than that might suggest, and the degree to which my like dating multiple people is motivated by sex is very low. Like that has almost nothing to do with it. It definitely has nothing to do at all, actually, with why I date multiple people, and it has very little to do with why I date people in the first place. Yeah, like I can easily be in a non-sexual romantic relationship. So it's funny to me, as somebody with that worldview, that polyamory gets conflated with promiscuity. And Piontek does talk briefly about polyamory. Specifically, he's talking about how among lesbians, at the same time that this like gay male sex wars was going on, he talks about how polyamory was kind of springing up as a queer alternative to the binary of either being promiscuous or being married, but particularly he talks about it among lesbians, and he talks about how, like, while there was this kind of backlash from AIDS where some gay men were trying to be more normative or seem more normative or seem less sexual or whatever it was, that at the same time some lesbians had learned the potential culture of promiscuity from gay men, and then weren't to the same extent influenced by the AIDS backlash and the fear of death in the community the way gay men were. And so some of them were looking for a way to be more sexual or like not necessarily more sexual, but looking for a way to have multiple partners, and marriage wasn't an option, and not necessarily wanting marriage, but also like it not being necessarily about just having a lot of sex and the promiscuity label. So he talks about like The Ethical Slut coming out, and that was, I didn't even think about the fact that was written by at least queer identified, I think, women, and some other stuff at the time. So it does get addressed, but I don't know, I think it's interesting the way this kind of idea of access to marriage, or the fact that you don't participate, and whether it's marriage or legal marriage or not, the idea of like anyone who doesn't subscribe to the relationship escalator of hitting certain milestones and your ultimate goal being a long-term committed monogamous partnership. The only other idea a lot of people have is, oh, you just must be having like a ton of sex, and potentially irresponsible sex, or potentially I don't know, like that emotions or romance or whatever doesn't play into it, which is like patently false. People of all orientations don't have to get married or have that particular model to be in a relationship. So anyway, I just thought I'd like throw that out there. Curious what folks think. If you are polyamorous, have you encountered this stereotype or myth? If you are a gay man in the 2020s now, do you think that this idea is still persists? Do you think the fact that marriage has become legal recently in the United States, at least, has changed this at all? Or do you think that the myth still exists? And how do you think those two things, queer and polyamory, mix when it comes to those assumptions and stereotypes? I'd be curious to hear it. So leave a comment below, and then subscribe if you want to see the next couple of topics that came out of reading this book for me.